What is going on, everybody? What's cracking? How's everybody doing on this fine Tuesday evening? Let me know you're live in the chat. We're going to have some more fun tonight. It's going to be good stuff. I'm going to go after the right. I'm going to go after the left. And I'm going to go after the left again. It'll be a conservative hate sandwich on left-wing bread. Or I guess, I don't know. Just gotta let some more people get up in here. What's going on with the chat, y'all? How you doing? Tell me how you doing. All right. Yeah, go after the center. Yeah, finally sunshine out here in Texas. I think it's supposed to rain again though, which I'm loving it. So I'm good with that. But glad to see everybody. If you didn't watch Lawrence B. Jones on Fox News just now during his primetime segment, you'll want to catch the replay of that, especially the part where he has King Randall on. I'll be talking about this later, but King Randall is a young man in Albany, I believe in Albany, Georgia, who's trying to start a school for disadvantaged youth, particularly black men, black young kids. I think high school, maybe like K through 12. But check him out, King Randall on Twitter. He's doing some amazing work. He's been doing this for a couple of years, and he's trying to start a school, and he's running into some obstacles that the local government is putting up. So definitely watch that segment because he explains it a little bit more there. But I'll be talking about this later because I am not surprised. I expected for him to run into an obstacle or a roadblock like this. Not saying that he can't overcome it. I think he will. But I knew that based on what he's doing and the approach he's taking, I knew that let's say local government wouldn't be so happy about it. So I'll cover that later. Again, I'll talk about it later, but check that out when you get a moment. I don't know how long it takes Fox News to put up their replays. I would think by later tonight or tomorrow morning. Check it out. It's very interesting. And I'm very glad to Lawrence Jones. Shout out to Lawrence Jones and Fox News. I like what he's doing. I mean, he's showcasing a lot of things that his audience wouldn't normally see on Fox News. So I'm glad that he's opening some eyes. I want to see more of that. It's awesome. It's incredible. But before I get started with the content, as always, please share and subscribe and share this video and subscribe to my feed. Hit that notification bell if you haven't already so that you'll get updated whenever I go live. I am changing up my schedule a bit because going Monday and Wednesday was a bit too taxing on me. So when I have more days in between live streams, and I think it's going to make it a lot easier on me. So I'm going to be going on Tuesday evenings at 8 o'clock Eastern Standard and on Friday evenings at 8 o'clock Central Standard. I think that'll be a lot easier for me. So as far as keeping up with the news and keeping up with my writing and all the other stuff that, all the other stuff that I'm doing. Also, if you want to do a one-time donation, or actually first, if you want to support my work, go ahead and sign up for my locals.com community. I actually just uploaded a video today giving some thoughts on the anniversary of George Floyd's murder. So that'll be behind the paywall. It's only $4.99 per month to subscribe, and you'll get content that other people don't get, like what I just uploaded today. And I'll be doing a lot more this week, actually. I think I've got a good rhythm down here. So you'll see more of that at my locals.com community. The link is in the show notes, but it is a freshperspective.locals.com. A freshperspective.locals.com. Every little bit helps. Or if you want to do a one-time donation, that helps as well. This thing's not working. The links are in the show notes too. My CashApp and Venmo. StreamYard doesn't want to cooperate when I'm trying to put it up here. Oh, there it is. Bam. So yeah, again, everything helps. I am a full-time content creator now. So if you like my work and you can support me, please support me. So now, I suppose without further ado, we're going to get into the stuff here. The first thing I want to talk about, and this is something that I've kind of been dealing with a lot over the past couple weeks. I've been talking a lot about how conservatives and Republican leaders need to do more if they want to win over the culture, and also if they want to win in the government. For decades, the Republican Party and the conservative movement has relied mainly on criticizing what the left does, which is appropriate. I mean, political parties criticize each other. There's nothing wrong with that. However, we've relied solely, almost solely, on criticizing what the left is doing. And I've been talking about this a lot. When there's a problem that America is facing that's getting a lot of attention, you will see the Democrats put forth a solution. Now, their solutions always involve more government, an expansion of the federal government, typically raising taxes and throwing more money at a situation, and basically getting people into a situation where they're more dependent on the government without actually solving their problems. It may help to a certain extent, but it doesn't actually address the underlying issues, thereby continuing to keep people more dependent on the government. So we see this happen over and over again. And on the right, what we do is we just criticize what the left is doing, and we point out the fact that it's going to get people more reliant on the government. We point out that it's going to make the government more powerful and more intrusive in the everyday lives of American citizens. And that's it. The right doesn't come up with their own ideas to compete with what the left is doing. So what happens is one of two things. The American people might reject what the Democrats are doing, but the problem still persists. Or they will accept what the Democrats are doing because at least they have an idea, even if it's flawed, even if it's deeply flawed, it's better than nothing, which is exactly what the Republican Party offers. They don't offer they don't tend to offer solutions very often. I'm not saying that they don't have solutions. I'm not saying that the conservative movement doesn't have ideas on how we address issues of, say, crime or schooling or things like that. We just don't bother to sell them. If selling those solutions is not a top priority. It's more about criticizing what the left is doing and being reactionaries and being the party of the opposition rather than being the competition where we're offering free market solutions based on freedom of choice and all that good stuff. So since we're not offering anything, the Democrats typically win eventually, and the problem doesn't get solved. And we just sit back and complain about how the problem isn't getting solved, but we don't put forth anything to compete. Now, I have been expressing this idea in various articles that I've written. I've been doing it on Twitter. And I just did a thread on this yesterday. But what's happening is I'm getting a lot of I'm getting a lot of responses that show that people aren't quite understanding what I'm saying. And it kind of taught me something. It kind of gave me some insight into the psyche on the right. And it's a little bit disturbing to me, to be frank about it. And I'm not saying that everybody's misunderstanding it. I think probably most get it, but there's a huge chunk that misunderstand it. So this tendency, as far as being opposition and not competition, it applies to a lot of different areas. In the thread that I wrote yesterday, I focused mainly on critical race theory because we've been talking about that a lot over the past couple of weeks, and it's been hot in the news. And the issue is that hard leftists, the Democrats, have this critical race theory, and this is supposed to help solve problems like racial disparities or racism in systems or societal racism. It's supposed to deal with racism in general, because whether people want to believe it or not, racism is still a thing in the United States. We've made tons of progress, but we still have a ways to go. And it's okay to acknowledge that if you're a conservative. It's not, like I always say, you're not going to turn into Jesse Jackson if you acknowledge that racism still is a force in America. You're not going to turn into Al Sharpton with a perm and all that. I promise you, it won't happen. So since these problems do exist, and also not just the problems today, the legacy of what the government did years ago, still dealing with the aftermath of that has created racial disparities artificially. These disparities didn't come about naturally. They were deliberately created by the federal government, state governments, local governments, and also by American society in general. So the left has critical race theory to help close that gap and to help fix that problem. But we know that there are serious issues with critical race theory, and I even did some more reading on it today, and it's not great. And again, there's going to be aspects of it that I agree with, because like most ideas that the progressives push, there's always a kernel of truth to it. But the problem is that they manipulate that truth, they exaggerate it, and they weaponize it to push their agenda. But again, they're at least putting something forward to deal with these issues while the right ignores it. And for the past few decades, conservatives' only contribution to this conversation was that there is no racism, or there's very little racism, or racism is on life support. It doesn't have an impact in society. They went the total opposite direction, which would explain why they've refused to put forth solutions to deal with that issue. Again, this doesn't apply to all conservatives. Does not apply to all Republicans, but in general, this is the approach that we have taken. But we can apply this to other issues too. Like issues that families deal with, economic issues, whether white, black, or otherwise. The Democrats have a solution: the American Families Plan or the American Rescue Plan. Biden has put forth these ideas, and again, they're bad ideas. They're bad ideas. They will do very little to solve these problems. They'll do something. I'm not going to say that they would completely do absolutely nothing, but the consequences, the cure would be worse than the disease. But even if that plan does not pass, the problems still remain as far as, education and economic issues, and especially with the whole COVID-19 outbreak, those problems are still there. So America would rather accept a bad plan than to accept nothing. And that's what the Republicans offer. See, here's the thing. Let's use an analogy. I know Scott Adams says that analogies are not good for persuasion, but I'm really just more trying to explain where I'm coming from right now. See, here's the thing. Imagine that there's a town that has no food. Everybody's starving. And there are two parties that have been tasked with coming up with a solution. Again, no food, no corn, no plants, no meat, which reminds me of my situation because I'm fasting from meat this week, in case you didn't see the announcement on Twitter. But imagine that situation. And one party says, hey, you know what? We found a way to make food. We are going to make bread out of the bodies of ants. We're going to mix in black licorice, and we're going to put Tabasco on it, and we can eat that so we can survive. And then the other side says, that sounds disgusting. That is the most disgusting thing I've ever heard of. Nobody wants to eat that. If the town is starving and people might die because of it, what are they going to choose? They're going to choose the nasty idea. They're going to choose the bread made out of the dead bodies of ants and black licorice and Tabasco sauce on it, because yeah, it might not taste too good. It might be a little gross, but you won't die if you eat it. On the other hand, they're not going to go with the other person's solutions because they didn't offer any solutions. They just talked about how nasty that food was. That's the situation that we have here. And it is the reason why, even let's say the American Families Plan doesn't pass. It may not. Eventually it will. Eventually we will adopt these policies because people will still be dealing with these problems. They'll come to a head. They'll get to a point to where they have to do something. And if the Democrats have a harmful idea that will at least still address some of the problem, they're going to go for that idea because they have no competition. Same thing with healthcare. We saw what happened there. Obamacare came out. Republicans were railing against it. The Tea Party was railing against it. Congress, GOP in Congress was railing against it. President Trump railed against it. And when it came time when the GOP controlled the House, the Senate, and the White House, what do? They did nothing because they had no ideas. They had nothing to compete with. They got criticized a lot by the left for just being the party of no, and that criticism was accurate. They deserve that criticism. And I know that conservatives are getting tired of it. But we haven't yet embraced this mindset in the base or among our influencers or our chattering class or in our elected officials, where we need to start focusing more on what we bring to the table than just saying that the left is bad. Now, here's the problem when people have pushed back on me on this, because some people just want to stay with what we've been doing. It can win in the short term, especially the Democrats do really stupid crap. Like we will probably win in 2022 because the Democrats are going to mishandle things. But it's not a good long-term strategy. And it's definitely not a good long-term strategy for actually affecting positive change. But here's the thing. When I say the Republicans and conservatives need to put forth ideas to compete with the left and offer the American people an alternative, they say things like, well, the Republicans shouldn't just go out and try to give more free stuff in the Democratic Party, or the Republicans shouldn't be trying to be more socialist than the Republican Party. Why should the Republican Party pander for votes of minorities? Well, that's what the left does. We don't want to be socialists. We're supposed to be more about getting the government out of the way. They immediately assume that the idea of a political party like the Republicans putting forth a competing idea automatically means more government. They just that is their knee-jerk reaction. They go immediately to, oh, he's talking about providing a more welfare or creating a bigger welfare state than the Democrats and seeing who can spend the most money to buy votes. It's not what I'm talking about. That's not what any of us are talking about. What we're talking about is when the Democrats put forth an idea that involves more government to solve a problem, we put forth a conservative idea that relies more on free markets, on getting the government out of the way. People always say, when I talk about, Black outreach, and I talk about, what's the Republican Party going to do for Black people? They say, well, the government shouldn't be doing anything for Black people. It shouldn't be doing anything for anybody. And I'm like, okay, you didn't put any thought into that. You didn't use any critical thinking when you responded to me that way. Now, some of these people, again, are just ignorant. And some of these people are genuinely, they just didn't think it through when they responded. They had a knee-jerk emotional reaction. But when I come back at them and I say, so you're telling me that a conservative mayor and a conservative city council can't get in office and remove regulations that are preventing Black entrepreneurs from starting and growing their business. That's what you're telling me right now? Are you telling me that a conservative candidate can't get into office and lower taxes? Are you saying that conservatives can't use programs that allow the free market to work in a way that's more effective, thereby helping to create more wealth? That's what you're telling me. Well, yeah, no, of course conservatives can do that. That's what they should do. I was like, okay, so wouldn't that be doing something for the Black community? Yes. Bam. Then they get it. Some of them don't, but a lot of them do. When they understand where I'm coming from, they get it. But here's my thing. Why are we not already thinking this way? Because this doesn't just apply to the Black community. This applies to everything. In fact, I just talked about the Democrats putting forth an idea and then the conservatives putting forth an idea. No, why can't conservatives be the first people to put forth an idea when a problem is identified? Why can't we be proactive? Why are we always having to be the party of no? I think some of that is because conservatives tend to be more change averse, which is part of being a conservative. We want to conserve things instead of changing them. But here's the thing. You can use conservative principles to bring about positive change. You can't just leave everything the way that it is. Not everything is worth conserving. Right now, we're having a conversation about police reform. And to his credit, Senator Tim Scott is out there and he's trying to talk about it. He's working with Cory Booker and he's getting bashed by Charlie Kirk for it. That's how entrenched this thinking is. The very notion that a Republican, Black or white, would actually try to introduce ideas, conservative ideas that could lead to positive change while even working with Democrats. By the way, some Democrats will put forth conservative solutions to some problems. I've heard stories. That thing is so entrenched that people like Charlie Kirk, who, I don't hate the guy, but he has no substance. He doesn't know much. He just knows what lines to rattle off, and he's not the only one. This is a conservative ink thing. This is not a Charlie Kirk thing. Then why do we not deserve to lose? Even President Trump had ideas. Now, people may not have liked his ideas, He said, okay, immigration is an issue. That's a problem. Let's build a wall. Let's put in some policies here that will allow more people to come in legally easier. Well, maybe not that. I think he was, it depends. He was kind of all over the place when it comes to legal immigration. But when it comes to illegal immigration, he knew what he wanted to do. And he had ideas. Why can't we have more of that? You know, what ideas did Mitt Romney have? John McCain? I can't think of anything. I think George W. Bush had some, as far as education goes. Again, not very good ideas, but still, we need to get out of this mindset where we're always just harping on what the left is doing. We need to move from being the opposition to the competition. And doing this doesn't mean becoming more like the left. Like, for instance, with critical race theory, I'm not arguing that conservatives should create a theory that also says that racism is embedded in America's psyche and that most Americans are racist. We don't need to do that. We need to come with something different that doesn't ignore the problem. Ignoring the problem is not coming up with a solution, by the way. With the race issue, there are conservative solutions that we can put into effect to close those racial disparities. But if we ignore the problem, then we don't get a seat at the table and we don't deserve one. Because if you're going to point out a flaw in somebody's argument or in somebody's plan, you better at least have something of an idea that you can maybe even build on before you actually pretend like you deserve people's support. You don't deserve their support just because the other guy is horrible. So that I wanted to clarify what I mean when I say being the competition, because a lot of people are misconstruing it, and I don't think there's any malice behind it. I don't think that a lot of them are purposely misconstruing it. Some are, but I mean, I think most people just, again, that's why this was so troubling to me, because this type of thinking, we have gotten so entrenched in this, and I've fallen into it myself. I'm not innocent here, but this type of thinking has become such a part of the right that we can't even think outside of it naturally. We have to work to do it. Our knee-jerk reaction is just to assume, oh, you're talking about more government. Not necessarily, no. So what you got in the chat here? Let's see. What we got? Yeah. Charlie Kirk trying to drag Tim Scott was peak 2021. Yeah, that didn't go too well for him, by the way. I saw a lot of people criticizing him, but I did see a lot of Sesame Street on Tim Scott's tweet as well. So I guess that kind of balances it out. My computer's lagging. Okay. Pretty sure there were 4 years of Democrat hair on fire with zero solutions when Trump was in office. Now, the Democrats still were putting forth ideas, but I will say that they focused more on Orange Man bad than anything else. One of the things that Trump accomplished was making the Democrats act like conservatives, because they became complete reactionaries. If Trump sneezed wrong, they freaked out. I loved it. I loved seeing it. I didn't like that it existed, but just seeing how stupid they acted, I'm like, yeah, we can cause the left to be reactionaries if we put forth ideas, policy ideas, and if we focus on selling them just as strongly as we do criticizing what the left is doing. I have said this many times. My background has been in sales. Whenever I've had sales mentors or had sales trainings, and I'm trying to get a customer from the competition, they didn't teach me to go in there and start bashing the other company. They said, no, you never do that. You never just go in there and bash the other company. As a matter of fact, you want to say as little negative about them as possible, because if you bash the other company, you are insulting your prospect, because you're like, wait, you're bashing this company. So what are you saying? I'm stupid from buying from them? That's the message that you send. Now, politics is a little bit different, but the same principle applies. You need to focus on what you bring to the table more than what the other guy is doing wrong. It's not persuasive to do it that way, at least not over the long term. Totally agree with offering better solutions, but there's also a huge media echo chamber that is difficult to overcome and a media blackout for conservative messaging. So to me, that's kind of a cop-out. Not saying that you're copping out, but I think that's an excuse that a lot of conservative leaders would throw at you. They would say, oh, well, we can't because of the media. No, there's conservative media. Conservative media is a thing. We have found ways to subvert the activist media. If we've done it before, we can do it again. We had talk radio for years where the left couldn't do anything about it because they couldn't control the medium. We can get our ideas out there if we actually bother to try. What else we got? Let's see. Okay. What else we got here? What are you guys talking about here? What else we got? Oh, Miss Pinky gave me a super chat. I appreciate it, sis. Competition instead of opposition. Exactly. And notice, I'm not saying that we should never criticize the Democrats. We should. We need to do it. But if that's all we're doing, we're not going to win long term. We have to be the competition, not just the opposition. What else we got here? All right, so I'm going to move on to the next thing here. Hey, the Fletch is in the house. What's up, Derek? Nice to see you. So the next thing I want to talk about is I want to talk about Black Lives Matter. Now, there was a study that came out recently. Some data came out that was analyzing the level of support for the Black Lives Matter movement. And that distinction is critical here because people were asked what they felt about the Black Lives Matter movement, not necessarily the global organization or the local chapters. Here's kind of an issue up front, though. If they ask people if they support the Black Lives Matter movement, not a lot of people make that distinction. And a lot of times people misunderstand, thinking that you're talking about the organization when you're really talking about the movement. So I would kind of wonder how much that plays into the data here, but I think it's still a good study. So the New York Times, they published a piece analyzing, again, the level of support for the Black Lives Matter organization over the past 3 or 4 or 5 years or so. And it noted that support for the movement overall peaked shortly after the murder of George Floyd. So from the article, it says, quote, though there is in the data reason for some optimism, the more general picture contradicts the idea that the country underwent a racial reckoning. Last summer, as Black Americans turned their sorrow into action, attitudes, especially white attitudes, shifted from tacit support to outright opposition, a pattern familiar in American history. Whereas support for Black Lives Matter remains relatively high among racial and ethnic minorities, support among white Americans has proved both fickle and volatile. So they're explaining that among more minorities, people still have the same attitudes in general towards Black Lives Matter, the movement. Whereas white Americans went up again after that footage was released of Derek Chauvin kneeling on George Floyd's neck. And then it didn't take very long for the support to start going down and for more white Americans to be disapproving of Black Lives Matter than approving. The article continues, quote, we observe a similar trend when we separate the data by racial group. Like other racial groups, white Americans were more supportive of BLM following Mr. Floyd's murder. This sentiment, however, did not last long, and as with Republicans, support eventually plunged. This movement among Republicans and white Americans helps us understand why aggregate support for Black Lives Matter has waned since last summer. Now, I look at the data, and they had a really nice chart that really laid it out, and you could filter it by race, you can filter it by age, by party affiliation. And what they're not really saying, I mean, they kind of allude to it, and I'm kind of surprised that they didn't just say it right out. But the bottom line is the support for what they're describing here is what happened among white Republicans mostly. White Democrats, their support went down a little bit, but not very dramatically. It was support among white Republicans. It went up during George Floyd. Now, it was never as high as white Democrats and and Democrats in general. But people on the right, white folks on the right, were more tolerant of Black Lives Matter and even supported the movement. And I remember seeing people saying, I support the movement, and people still say that I support the movement, but not the organization. I do believe that a lot of Republicans are getting them mixed up. Some understand the difference. Others don't, or even among the ones who do understand the difference, if I ask them, do you like Black Lives Matter? Many of them are thinking of the organization, so they say no. But if I specify, do you agree with the Black Lives Matter movement or the sentiment that Black Lives Matter, they'll say yes. But either way, regardless of how they understood the question, it is clear that Republican support for Black Lives Matter was basically contingent on what happened with George Floyd. So what are the reasons for this? What is this shift for? What is the reason for the shift in attitudes among white conservatives towards BLM? The article gives some reasons. It says, quote, "First, it seems clear that at least some of this surge reflected shock and disapproval over this particular episode, rather than a broad embrace of a political movement with a specific agenda." So I think there's truth to that. One of the reasons for the support was just the fact that it was so egregious, that footage was so horrific, that it moved them to at least consider Black Lives Matter something that is valid. The article continues, quote, "George Floyd's death was documented by a video that was both viscerally upsetting and morally unambiguous. A police officer kneeling on the neck of a restrained individual in broad daylight for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. It left scant room for individuals to fill in the gaps with their own narratives." Now, as we know, it didn't end up that way, especially among conservatives. There's a deeper reality, which I'm going to get to in a second. The article continues, quote, "And if high levels of support for BLM following George Floyd's death were surprising, the quick about face was anything but. The precipitous decline in support, especially among Republicans and white Americans, mirrors the increased politicization of the issue by elites. In the days and weeks following Floyd's death, Republican politicians quickly turned attention away from the actions of a murderous police officer to those individuals protesting the injustice." Now, that last sentence isn't very honest, because they weren't focusing on the peaceful protests. They were focusing on the riots, and the authors of this article know that. So, but they're mincing words here to try to make it sound like conservatives were all bent out of shape because people were holding up signs and chanting Black Lives Matter. Some were, but in general, no, that wasn't a thing. But it was interesting when he talks about the increased politicization of the issue by the elites. Now, there were elites on both sides who were politicizing this issue, and he's absolutely right. And I'm going to get into that because I think that, especially on the right, that is one of the things that led to the decline in support for Black Lives Matter, the movement. The rank and file people out there just chanting Black Lives Matter, and they went back to work or whatever. But also, one thing that's also important to notice is that it wasn't just white Republicans. It was just Republicans in general whose attitudes shifted after the George Floyd video came out and then after the riot started. So I blame a few things for this drop in support for Black Lives Matter. Again, the movement. I'm not talking about the global organization. I'm just talking about the underlying sentiment that police brutality in the Black community is an issue that should be solved. So for starters, it didn't take that long after Floyd's murder and after that footage went viral. It didn't take too long for right-wing media to start becoming dishonest. Now, what I'm about to say does not apply to every single conservative journalist and every single right-wing influencer and every single Republican politician. It applies to a lot of them, though. And it applies to the loudest among us, I'll say. And it didn't take too long for Conservative Inc. and Black Conservative Inc. to start focusing primarily on George Floyd's criminal record and his drug use. You might remember this. You might remember that they went off on their usual campaign to smear the victim to distract from the actions of the police officer. Now, remember, like I've said this before, I've got the 3 Ds, right? Whenever the authoritarian right is confronted with an act of police brutality that they wish to politicize, they do the 3 Ds: defend, deflect, and dehumanize. So they'll, if they can, they will defend the actions of the officers. Now, there wasn't a whole lot of that until the footage of what happened before the encounter was released. But even that didn't really give them much room to defend it. They just said, oh, well, he wasn't racist. They were nice to him before, which they weren't, but they were more cordial. Therefore, this isn't an act of racism, so we'll defend him on that. But what they did mainly, the tactic that they used, the two tactics that they used was deflection and dehumanization. They found ways to deflect from what Derek Chauvin did and focus it on something else so that people on the right would not be as outraged at a government official killing somebody in broad daylight for no good reason. And of course, they dehumanized Floyd. They're still dehumanizing Floyd. Oh, well, he was a drug addict. He had a criminal record. He held a gun on a pregnant woman when he was robbing her 10, 15 years ago. They don't mention that he served his time for that, right? But they wanted you to hate George Floyd so that even though you might acknowledge that what Derek Chauvin was wrong, you don't care as much. Like I always use the analogy, if George Floyd had shot an old lady right before that happened, I would still say it's wrong, but I wouldn't care that much because he was a piece of crap at that moment. Now, I'm not going to go into George Floyd's life like that because I do know that later in his life, he was trying to clean himself up. He was trying to change. He was trying to push for better in his life. And the drug use doesn't mean anything to me because he got hooked on drugs for the same reason that Rush Limbaugh did. He had back pain. He had chronic back pain, he and his girlfriend. So he was taking fentanyl for it and ended up getting hooked. He didn't just get hooked on drugs because he just felt like taking drugs. There are a lot of Americans, black, white, and otherwise, who get hooked the exact same way. So he wasn't a druggie in the streets and stuff like that. There's no evidence of that. So yes, he had done stuff wrong in the past, and he was trying to move towards better. They were actually trying to break their addiction. But as anybody who has either been addicted or has had friends and family who have been addicted, it's not quite as easy as, conservative ink would want you to think. So people struggle with it. But again, they didn't care about this because their goal wasn't to look at the situation honestly. Their objective was to dehumanize Floyd to protect the state. So during this time period, they went so far as to even lie. And what I'm talking about, people in the media, right-wing media, they went so far as to lie either by commission or omission about the Hennepin County medical examiner's report, which found that Floyd's death was a homicide. That means that Floyd was killed by the actions of another human. Now, it doesn't automatically mean murder or manslaughter or what have you. That was for the jury to decide. But even now, after the trial, there are a lot of people on the right, and I'm seeing them, they still believe that the report says that George Floyd died of an overdose, even though it said no such thing. It acknowledged the level of drugs in his system. There were a lot of things that the medical examiner said, but you can watch my previous videos on this for more of an explanation. I go through all of these lies and I debunk them. You can still have the truth of the situation, all the facts, and still disagree with me on it. But the problem is that they were lying to their audiences. Some were doing it on purpose, I believe. Again, this is my opinion. Others were just doing it because they didn't bother to seek out the information. They didn't care what the truth was. And others just honestly made a mistake. They believed what they were being told, and they shouldn't have. If you're a commentator, you shouldn't just believe what you're being told. You should look it up. Every single one of them could have looked up the actual original paperwork that the medical examiner put out. So that was an issue. I mean, the media was lying. And also, when the riots kicked off, they also contributed to the lack of support. Part of that's understandable because, and I can't blame this just on the media. I blame this on the rioters too, because they wouldn't have rioted. They wouldn't have given the media the ammo to use the riots to deflect from what Officer Chauvin did. So the people who decided to tear up Black communities, they made the peaceful protesters look bad. And to people who are dishonest on the right, they use that to distract from what happened. They're saying, oh, well, I mean, what happened to George Floyd was wrong, but now it's getting eclipsed by these riots. Well, no, it's being eclipsed by the riots because you're doing that. You're the ones making it eclipse what happened to George Floyd. It made it easier for conservative media to peddle another dishonest narrative. And this narrative was that the most of the demonstrations were violent in nature, or like a huge chunk of these demonstrations were violent. Again, I have my issues with the global Black Lives Matter organization. I even have some issues with the movement. I have some issues with the local chapters, but I will not lie about them. I mean, there are issues in this whole thing that are bad enough to where we don't have to lie about it. We can just point out what's actually happening. But anyway, people like Tucker Carlson and others on the right, they convinced their audiences to essentially believe that Black Lives Matter protesters were burning down entire cities with their hyperbolic rhetoric. And I've seen people say, oh, they were burning down Minneapolis, they were burning down LA. No, they weren't burning down the whole city. It was just a small area that some stupid people came in and rioted in. Many of these people didn't even bother to mention that Antifa, white progressives, their operatives, were one of the main groups participating in the violence. Now, some were honest about that. I will say that. I saw some conservative commentators who I may not have agreed with about the riots and Black Lives Matter. I saw them at least admitting that this wasn't all Black people doing this. And that some of them even admitted in a lot of these cases, it was mostly white people in a lot of these instances. Now, they also didn't even acknowledge that a lot of the people rioting had nothing to do with Black Lives Matter. They didn't care anything about George Floyd. They were just there to steal crap, and that was it. They were opportunists. So I'm going to pause for a second because my computer's about to die and I forgot to bring my charger. I will be right back. Hold that thought. Hold that thought. All right, I'm back. I'll plug this in really quick. See, this is what happens when you get distracted too easily. All right, you're still here. I appreciate it. Okay, so I'm going to continue where I left off. So where I left off was talking about how there were a lot of different groups that were involved in the riots. But again, a lot of conservative commentators didn't acknowledge this. They continued to call it just Black Lives Matter riots. Now, why were they doing this? They were doing this because they wanted their audiences to believe that Black Lives Matter was the main culprit, that the organization or the movement was the one putting on these riots. And now in some cases that was true. I'm not saying Black Lives Matter was innocent. That's not what I'm saying. That's not the argument that I'm making. There were plenty of people who were involved with the protests who also wanted to riot. But if you were actually trying to be truthful about this, you would acknowledge the other elements in the equation, not just the one that allows you to sensationalize and to promote a narrative. So, and you can see how badly they wanted this narrative to stick. And you can see this by how they reacted. Remember when that study came out that showed that only 8% of the demonstrations turned out to be violent? They reacted, the way they reacted just let me further know that they were doing this on purpose, because they flew into a tizzy. You guys might remember this. You remember when all those right-wing commentators flew into a tizzy when they were trying to spin this revelation? They pulled out every argument that they could to distract from the fact that the overwhelming majority of protesters were not violent. Then they had the nerve to get mad when the left-wing activist media tried to smear all conservatives who were at the Capitol on January 6th as rioters, when it was really just a very small percentage who participated in the violence. Turnabout is fair play, right? I mean, this is where we have inconsistent principles, which means we don't really have principles. We only apply them based on political affiliation. The left isn't innocent because they were trying to spin the riots too in their direction. But the bottom line is, when that study came out, it was obvious that the right-wing narrative about the riots wasn't quite as true as they wanted their audiences to believe. So they still try to say, well, 8% is still this much property damage and yada, yada, yada. And I'm not saying those numbers aren't true, but the notion that you're trying to paint an entire movement as rioters is absurd. You lied to your audience, because even before that study came out, I knew that it was only a small percentage of people that were rioting. Everybody knew that. But they were still trying to push that lie. Even in the debate that I did with that Groyper paleo conservative type, he tried to pull this crap too. He tried to make it sound like, supporting the Black Lives Matter movement means that you support riots. He failed at it. He wasn't very good at it, but there are other people who are trained to do this, and they made it sound that way. If you support Black Lives Matter, that means you support riots. They don't introduce any nuance because they don't care. Not a single one of these people tried to educate their audience on what Black Lives Matter actually is. Instead of focusing on the destructive flaws of the global organization, they just chose to lie about them when, like I said, it wasn't even necessary. There is enough wrong with the Black Lives Matter global organization to where you don't have to lie about it. You can just tell the truth, and it's already a turnoff. Like, if you ask the random Black person if they agree with all the tenets that the global organization had on their website before they took it off, they would say no. So there was no reason to lie. They missed I can't even say missed an opportunity to engage with Black voters. They didn't miss it because missing implies that they actually want that to happen, and then they just messed it up. Now, I think this was deliberate. I'm not claiming to have inside information where I know that this is true for a fact. This is my opinion based on their actions. I give them way too much credit to actually believe that they were dumb enough to think that the way they handled this was being done in a way that would promote conversations between the conservative movement and the Black community. They don't want those conversations. They want the opposite of that. The spirit of the lily white movement is still alive. It just took on a different form. So yeah, I said it. It's true. The lily white movement, its legacy is still alive in the Republican Party and on the right. It just takes on a different form. And you saw that by the way that conservative media, some members of conservative media, handled the George Floyd issue. And I will say that and acknowledge, like I said, there were some commentators on the right who did a good job with this stuff. May have disagreements on little details, but I don't care. I don't need people to agree with me 100%. But the bottom line is, people ask, why don't Black people vote for Republicans? And to me, it's always a question that has vexed me, because the answer is right in front of your face if you're looking. And again, I don't think that they're ignoring it on purpose. I just think, again, they don't know what they don't know. They don't notice the stuff that people like you and I notice. When you cover things in this fashion, when you react to anything Black with this type of reaction, you're only going to push them away. And again, this is being done by people who either don't care about having more Black people or more minorities over on the right, or actively don't want that to happen, like the guy I debated a couple weeks ago, because they want the party to stay mostly white. And that's what we're up against. Now, the tide is turning. I expect for there to be roadblocks along the way. This was one of them. The way that conservatives reacted to the killing of Ahmaud Arbery was promising, because I know if that happened 5 or 10 years ago, people would be creating justifications out of whole cloth to defend the McMichaels and their neighbor. Even with the way that they reacted to George Floyd, most conservatives still think that he should have been punished. So that is progress, because again, if this happened 10 years ago, you would have had 80% of conservatives raising money for Derek Chauvin's defense. I might be being too hard on them. No, I'm not being too hard on them. That's what would happen. We all know it. It's okay to admit it. But the issue isn't so much that there are people on the right doing this, promoting false narratives and promoting destructive ideas about how the Republican Party shouldn't deal with Black voters. That's not the issue. The issue is that we need more people pushing back against that. That's why I said when I saw that Charlie Kirk tweet about Tim Scott, and I saw a lot of conservatives criticizing him, I said, okay, there's some progress happening. We need more of that, but that's better than having a bunch of conservatives on there agreeing with them because they don't know what the hell they're talking about. So we need more of this. I mean, when we see our media figures promoting narratives that are destructive, yeah, they've got free speech. They've got the right to say what they want to say. But the thing is, so do you. So do I. And it can't just be me calling this stuff out. I'm not saying people should be harassing anybody or making personal attacks. Not really into that. But it's okay to push back. People ask me like, are you ever scared to say the things that you say? I'm like, no. Why would I be afraid? What are they going to do to me? Nothing. First off, these people couldn't even match my level of knowledge on this subject. So when they try to push back against me, they're pushing back against somebody who knows way more than they do, right? It would be like a 9-year-old trying to argue with a rocket scientist. And it's not because I'm so brilliant. I just did my research. I did my reading. And also I'm a Black man, so I have the experience, right? But still, nothing's going to happen. And I'm not afraid. I know I rock the boat. So what? People would rather you be honest than to be clearly fake, like some of the people that we see out there whose names I shall not mention. So just wanted to give you guys something to think about there. I mean, it was very interesting to see that data. I'll put the link in the show notes and I'll tweet it out too, but take a look at it for yourself. And again, I'm not even saying that people have to support Black Lives Matter. The problem, I think, it's not so much that support for Black Lives Matter went down among Republicans. It's the reason why it did. I mean, because you don't necessarily have to sign on to whatever group comes up. Maybe you create your own, or maybe you just express your own opinion about what's happening with police brutality in the Black community. It's not all about Black Lives Matter, but it's just yet another issue or another instance where conservatives have to be careful about what their media is saying. We already know that the left-wing media lies, but you guys, if you really want to be red-pilled isn't just recognizing that left-wing media lies. It's recognizing that the entire media apparatus lies to you. Not everybody in there, because there are honest journalists on the left. There are plenty of honest journalists and commentators on the right too. I'm just saying, if there's a narrative that's being spread, or even better yet, if something happens and you can predict what all the commentators are going to say, you should start questioning that shit because there's a reason why you're able to predict it. I can always predict it, and I'm not anybody special. I mean, I'm paying attention to all this stuff, but with some of this stuff, it's not hard to see. It's not hard to predict because you just see how they act. Question it. Hell, question what I say. Don't just take what I say at face value. Do your own digging. You're going to find out that I'm right, but don't just take everything that I say as gospel, because I get things wrong. I mean, I'm not going to lie to you, but I get things wrong. I'm not perfect. And that is the exact same attitude that you should have towards Fox News and other conservative media as well, because they tend to have an objective. And I'm not trying to bash Fox News. There's stuff that I like about Fox News too. I don't really watch cable news in general, so I'm not really all that attached to them. But I like Greg Gutfeld. He's pretty cool. Not a fan of Tucker Carlson, but that's okay. I mean, I'm sure that if I actually watched it, there would be other people that I like. But still, question everything. Don't take it at face value, even if it sounds good. Even if it's just countering what the left says. Yeah, the left might be wrong, but that doesn't always make the right. So, yeah. All right, I've beaten that to death already. I'm already running out of time. I've got one more subject here. I'll take a quick look in the chat. Let's see. Oh, so y'all were partying while I went to get my charger. I see what's going on. Let's see. Now, this is an interesting point. Conservatives, this is The Alchemist. Conservatives claim to be Christian, but behave like the devil when it comes to the plight of the regular American. They have the I am better than you attitude. I mean, I can't say you're wrong. I mean, there is a lot of both sides have self-righteousness, right? It just takes different forms. We have our issues too. I mean, and the thing is, we claim to be Christians, right? We claim to follow the teachings of Jesus. But if you see the way they reacted to George Floyd, can't say it's very Christ-like. Even if you don't agree with the sentencing, that doesn't mean you should have a non-Christ-like attitude, because I can guarantee you that Jesus would never say any of the stuff that some of these people are saying about George Floyd and other Black people who get murdered by the police. Ryan Whittaker, Duncan Lemp, Tony Timpa, unconstitutional civil asset forfeiture. Now, I'm not sure where you're going with that, The Alchemist, but I'm going to weigh in on that. They should be just as angry about these murders too, because yes, Ryan Whittaker was murdered. Daniel Shaver was murdered. Duncan Lemp was murdered. Tony Timpa was murdered by police. These were white people. And here's what's sad. Black Lives Matter cares about every name that I just listed off more than white conservatives do. Because Black Lives Matter, the local chapters, some of them marched, some of them tried to find ways to support the families of the victims. Black Lives Matter cares more about these people than you do. So I don't understand why a lot of white conservatives will even bother to bring up the name of Duncan Lemp, because you don't care that what happened to him. You don't care about happened to Ryan Whittaker. Oh, well, why isn't the media calling for riots and protests over Tony Timpa? No, stupid, you do the protest. If you have a platform of hundreds and thousands of people, you should never be complaining about the media not focusing on what happened to Tony Timpa, Daniel Shaver, Ryan Whittaker, and Duncan Lemp. You should never be complaining that nobody organized a protest when you know good and hell well that you could have organized that shit, and people would have showed up. Who cares what the left is doing? Like, we can't just keep letting our behavior be dictated to us by the left. Who gives a shit what they say? Don't you have your own ideas? Yeah. If there was a white guy here in Austin that got shot by the police and it was unfair, and somebody organized a protest, I would be there. I would be covering it. I would use every ounce of my platform to highlight it. And I've written about some of these white men who were killed by police officers unfairly. And it's absurd that conservatives can't think outside of what their media is telling them, to say, you know what? Maybe I shouldn't just bring up Duncan Lemp because I need to counter what the left is saying. Maybe I shouldn't stand on his grave and use him as a political cudgel. See, white conservatives will do that with white people, with other white people, just like the left will stand on the graves of Black men who were killed by the police to push their agenda. Pox on both your houses. I hate you both. What else we got here? All right. Man, y'all need to stop talking about Candace Owens. She's not the only one. There's a bunch of them. Corey Fraser, G Fraser, what's up, bro? You can't tell people this kind of truth, bro. Yes, I can. They can feel however they want about it. I don't give a, you know what. Write it down, take a picture. What else we got? Trigger Happy Policeman. I think he says Trigger Happy Policin', doesn't he? The Marvin Gaye song, Make Me Want to Holler. That's my favorite Marvin Gaye song. So thanks for bringing that up. I might listen to that after this live stream. But I'm going to go on with the next thing here, and I'm going to do it quickly. I want to talk about an article written by one of my colleagues at libertynation.com. And his name is Graham Noble. I call him the British badass because he's British and he's a badass. Now, this guy, Graham Noble, and I'll put the link in there, but this guy is a man after my own heart with the way he expresses himself. He's very colorful, and he's got that same attitude that I have, where he just doesn't care what you think about what he has to say. He's going to say it. This guy was special forces for the British military back in the day. So he's tough as nails, mentally and physically. I love this guy. But he wrote an article, and that brought up a very interesting point, because we've seen the rise in anti-Jewish hate crimes, especially with the hostilities going on between Israel and the Palestinians. I'm not going to get into that right now. Again, I'll be talking about it later, because I have a feeling that this is going to continue to be in the news. Even though there's a ceasefire right now, I don't think this issue is going away just yet. But again, the anti-Jewish hate crimes that have sprung up in response to this conflict. And he wrote an article about it, and he's asking, should the left be blamed for anti-Jewish hate crimes? So in his article, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm just going to quote from it. He writes, quote, "To what extent do the verbal and written statements of people in positions of power and influence incite physical violence? Is it fair to make the connection in every instance, in only some instances, or not at all? To put it in basic terms, do words really matter? If the answer to that last question is yes, then is it not time for the legacy media to acknowledge a link between their own condemnations of Israeli policy towards the Palestinians, along with the incendiary anti-Israel rhetoric of certain elected Democrats and the recent surge in threats and violent attacks against Jews in America?" Excellent question. I'm going to continue. Quote, "For many years now, it has not been uncommon for Democratic Party politicians and their media flunkies to eagerly draw connections between the words of elected Republicans or prominent conservatives and various acts or threats of violence, both real and imagined. Former President Donald Trump was even impeached for supposedly inciting a violent insurrection in Washington, D.C. on January 6th. The case against him was largely based upon the fact that he addressed a crowd of supporters that day in the nation's capital and told them, if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore." Interesting point, because especially since President Trump, I mean, using the words fight, politicians use that word all the time. They always talk about, we have to fight for our country. We have to fight for our nation. We have to fight against those evil Republicans who want to take away your health care and throw you out in the street and shoot you execution style in the back of the head. We have to fight against that. And it's a very interesting question here, because the left never applies this principle to their own. They can say everything that they want about Israel, but they will not blame themselves for attacks against Jewish Americans. Now, the article continues, quote, "Similarly, Republican politicians, Trump himself not least among them, and even many ordinary American conservatives have been accused of fomenting violence against Asian Americans simply for using terms such as the China virus or the Wuhan flu." Hope that doesn't get me banned by YouTube. But a lot of Republicans and people have been accused of inciting violence against Asian Americans for that reason. As a matter of fact, I recently wrote an article about this last week. There is a Chinese civil rights group that just filed a lawsuit against former President Donald Trump for using those terms while he was in office. And they're claiming that he harmed the Chinese American community by using those terms. They are asking for, I think, like 24 or 25 million in damages so that they can use it to build a museum noting the contributions of Chinese Americans and Asian Americans to the United States, which I don't have a problem with them building that museum. That sounds like it'd be awesome. But this is a shakedown, right? I mean, they're using the public sentiment that's being promoted by the left to try to cash in. It's grifting season. They deserve a grifty. I might nominate them. But again, people on the left love to make these accusations against Republicans. The article continues, quote, "Perhaps everybody caught up in the finger pointing over words allegedly leading to violence should take a deep breath and ask themselves what kind of person would physically assault a stranger who looks Asian because they heard someone say China virus. Such an individual almost certainly struggles with psychological issues and might have been inspired to violence by any number of outside influences. Now, this is what a rational person would say. And by the way, there are rational people on the left who would agree with this. I know they would, because I've seen some of them kind of speak out against this stuff. No sane person actually thinks that people are assaulting Asian people because conservatives use certain terms to describe the COVID-19 outbreak. So I'm going to skip. He says, he then says, quote, back to the current Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the attacks against American Jews. If one supports the argument that referring to COVID-19 as the, you know what, I won't say it again because I don't want YouTube to mess me up, that referring to COVID-19 as you know what inspires physical violence against Asian Americans, then one cannot deny that portraying Israel as an apartheid state or saying that there must be a full accounting of Israel's actions during the recent military escalation might lead to physical acts of retribution against Jews. He continues, quote, Representative Ocasio-Cortez recently tweeted in reference to Israel, apartheid states aren't democracies. On May 10th, Representative Ilhan Omar described Israeli airstrikes against targets in the Gaza Strip as an act of terrorism. Senator Robert Menendez, another Democrat, has said there must be a full accounting of actions that have led to civilian deaths and destruction of media outlets. Now, he says, quote, for context, the senator was not referring to both sides in the conflict. He had asserted that he was deeply troubled by reports of Israeli military actions that result in the death of innocent civilians in Gaza, as well as Israeli targeting of buildings housing international media outlets. And then he continues, he quotes Bernie Sanders, who said that the US government is acting like apologists for the Israeli government's undemocratic and racist behavior. So they've used some pretty harsh words against Israel, which is the world's only Jewish nation. And Graham Noble also says, quote, there has been a disturbingly frequent pattern of anti-Semitic and or pro-Nazi comments from individuals connected to the left-wing media surfacing, only to be ignored, swept aside, and covered up. As just one example, a longtime CNN freelancer was recently busted for tweeting, the world today needs a Hitler. Now imagine if somebody on the right said something like that. We all know what would happen, right? So he goes on to explain this further. And the point that he's making is if words inspire violence, does it somehow change when it's somebody on the left doing it? Because, again, they went after President Trump for supposedly inciting a riot. They've criticized conservatives for inciting violence against Asian Americans, but you did not see the same energy when that gunman went to that baseball field and tried to assassinate Republican lawmakers. Did they tie that to Bernie Sanders? The guy was screaming out slogans that Bernie Sanders used on the campaign trail. Shouldn't we blame Bernie Sanders for that? It seems like, again, when I talk about principles, if you apply your principles based on political affiliation, then you don't really have any principles. You don't actually believe the words that are coming out of your mouth. If you're saying that words can inspire violence, so we need to be careful about what we say, but you only criticize it when it's your political opposition who does it, then you don't really believe what you say. You're actually okay with inciting violence. You're okay with using harsh language. You don't believe that people should be careful about what they say. You only believe that certain people should. You know, some animals are more equal than others, right? So what's good for, so it's that attitude. It's good for thee, but not for me. Now, I'm not saying Republicans don't do this too, but on this particular issue, the left does this far more. The Democrats are far worse about this than people on the right are. Now, people on the right might point out the hypocrisy. You know, if somebody on the left says something jacked up about a group of people, they'll say, well, yeah, what if a Republican had said that? Shouldn't you be, castigating them because they're inciting violence? Because we have the evidence. People are beating up Jews. People are attacking Jews. So doesn't that mean that these Democrats should be to blame for that? Of course not. Now, I can respect somebody who's consistent. Like if somebody says, I believe that this is inciting violence regardless of who does it, I disagree with that. but I can respect the consistency. Now I know that I'm dealing with a person who actually has some principles. They just disagree with mine. The way I see it, neither are guilty. President Trump's not guilty. Bernie Sanders isn't guilty. Nobody's guilty for inciting violence against Asian Americans. And like Graham Noble said, and I'm glad that he made this point. He said, anybody who would attack another human being, an Asian American, because somebody used China to describe the coronavirus, that person's got some issues. Can't blame that on Trump. Can't blame that on conservative. That person's got some other outside issues that they need to deal with. And you can't just blame people based on political affiliation. So I'm going to stop right there. I'll take a look at the chat. What else we got? That's interesting. The Alchemist. I used to be a full con Inc. as well, conservative Inc. I watched Shapiro, Tim Pool, and the likes for over 2 to 3 years. Then last year happened and I saw the light. And you know what's funny? I used to listen to Ben Shapiro all the time, but I don't listen to him anymore. And there's really no reason for it. It's not because I dislike Ben Shapiro. I don't dislike Ben Shapiro. I mean, I disagree with a lot of what with a lot of what he says, and with other stuff, he's on point. I have no personal issue with Ben Shapiro. It just got to where I'm like, okay, I mean, I guess he was good for keeping up with what was going on. But when I started doing this full time, I'm already kept up to date, so I don't need to listen to him for that reason. And I basically know his opinions on things. So whatever. Tim Pool is kind of a different story. I rarely listen to Tim Pool. And the reason why is because he just got too sensational for me. Like, he's always talking, every headline is Democrats are panicking, or we're going to have a civil war, or whatever. And I know the dude's got to make his money, so he knows that gets clicks. I don't begrudge him for it. It's just not my cup of tea. And when he lied about Ahmaud Arbery, that bugged me, because before that point, I would notice that if he would make a statement and then it turned out to be wrong, he would correct himself. I'm sure he didn't do it all the time. You can't catch everything. But with Ahmaud Arbery, he blatantly lied about that and continued to lie even after other facts came out about that case. He was trying to cast him as, oh, he was there to burglarize houses and he was a thug, yada, yada, yada. He just did the conservative Inc. line on that, right? And I would have still had more respect for him if he came back later and said, okay, so new facts came out, and this footage of the guy in the other house that came out earlier in the year, that wasn't him, that was somebody else. I mean, if he would have walked back some of that, I'd be like, okay, that's cool, he can admit when he's wrong. But the fact is, I've seen him admit when he's wrong, and in this area he didn't. That bothers me. Like, why would you not have that standard when it comes to this issue? So yeah, I don't really listen to him that much anymore, but whatever. Is Tim Pool conservative Inc.? Yeah, he's conservative Inc. I know he's on the left, but he's conservative Inc. And people who listen to him know what I'm talking about. I mean, he panders to us, and again, I don't begrudge him. I mean, there are a lot of things he says I agree with, but I just can't get with the whole sensationalizing everything. I can't, like, not everything is a disaster. Not everything is frantic or whatever. He's not the only one that does it, but it kind of wore on me after a little bit. I was like, I can't listen to this anymore, even though, he's making some good points. I'll say that Tim Pool is on the left, but he panders to conservative Inc. That's what's going on. Chad Lemoyne, what's going on, brother? Looking forward to talking to you tomorrow, I think. Yeah. Let's see. All right. How about the violence against Rand Paul? Where's the left's outrage over that? I've seen nothing but jokes from them. And they say all kinds of horrible crap about Rand Paul. So, yeah, they're responsible for his neighbor beating him up. They caused that by their own standards. Saul Alinsky, one of his rules, you got to hold your opposition to their own standards. Problem is that when they don't really have standards that they believe in, you can't really do it. Well, I guess you can, because you can point out the fact that they don't have principles. All right. So I think I'm going to stop there, but I thank everybody for showing up. I hope this new time works for you, or these new days. It'll be a lot easier on me. And if you haven't already, please share this video, and please subscribe, hit that notification bell. If you want to support my work, then go to my locals.com community at afreshperspective.locals.com. All the links are in the show notes. And until next time, keep your minds free.